The strike that may matter most in this war was not aimed at a runway, a bunker, or a border post. It was aimed at the companies that keep Israel's air defenses alive. On March 16th, Iranian state-linked media reported that Iran launched Fatah missiles, along with Imad and Ghadar ballistic missiles and drones, at Rafael Advanced Defense Systems and Israel Aerospace Industries. If that reporting is even partly accurate, this was a major shift in strategy. Iran did not just target Israel's military. It targeted the production base behind Israel's ability to keep intercepting future attacks, and that opens a much bigger question. Was this less about immediate damage and more about forcing a shortage Israel may already be facing? That is what makes this different. Most people hear names like Iron Dome, David's Sling, Arrow 2, and Arrow 3 and think of them as abstract military programs. They are not abstract. They are built, maintained, upgraded, and replenished by real industrial networks. Rafael is central to that network. It produces Iron Dome interceptors, David's Sling components, Spike missiles, and the Iron Beam program that Israel has been pushing forward because lasers are far cheaper than firing expensive interceptors at drones and rockets. Rafael also sits inside Israel's broader electronic warfare and defense technology ecosystem. Israel Aerospace Industries is just as important. It manufactures Arrow 2 and Arrow 3, the high-end interceptors meant to deal with ballistic missile threats at high altitude and even outside the atmosphere. It also produces drones, missile systems, satellite infrastructure, and critical aerospace components. Put those two companies together, and you are looking at a large part of the machinery that keeps Israel's air defense architecture functioning. So if Iran really chose those sites deliberately, it was making a very specific calculation. Don't just challenge the defense system in the sky, go after the pipeline that keeps it supplied. That would already be serious. Then another piece fell into place. 2 days before those reported strikes, U.S. officials were cited saying Israel had warned Washington that its interceptor stocks were running dangerously low. That matters because Israel did not enter this phase of the war with full magazines. The June 2025 conflict had already burned through large numbers of interceptors. Open-source estimates from that earlier war suggested the use of at least 34 Arrow 3 interceptors, roughly 9 Arrow 2S, and 39 THAAD interceptors in only 12 days. THAAD alone represented well over $495 million in expenditure. And here is where the pressure becomes strategic rather than tactical. These are not cheap weapons, and they are not mass-produced at wartime speed. Arrow interceptors cost millions per shot. THAAD interceptors are typically estimated around $12.7 million each. A THAAD battery carries just 48 interceptors and requires U.S. personnel to operate. The projected annual U.S. output is limited enough that one short war can consume a startling share of what is available. Last year's fighting reportedly used up more than a full year of planned THAAD production. So when people say Israel may be running low, that does not mean one difficult week. It means the replacement cycle itself may be under stress. Israel's own actions point to urgency. Shortly after those reports surfaced, the government approved an emergency transfer of about 2.66 billion shekels, roughly $826 million for defense procurement, reportedly through a late-night phone vote that came after a much larger wartime budget expansion of around 32 billion shekels. Governments do not move money that way unless they believe time matters. And then comes the missile question, which may be the most unsettling part of all. Months before this war escalated, a senior Rafael executive publicly acknowledged that Iranian advances in so-called hypersonic or near-hypersonic systems were forcing a rethink of air defense doctrine. The warning was blunt, the old idea of simply launching a faster interceptor after an incoming missile no longer solves the problem once the target can maneuver unpredictably during re-entry. That points directly to the Fatah. Analysts still argue over terminology. Some dispute whether the Fatah 1 should be classified as truly hypersonic in the strict technical sense, but the label is less important than the behavior. The missile reportedly uses a maneuverable re-entry vehicle, which means it does not descend on a neat, easily modeled ballistic path. It can shift direction during the final phase of flight, complicating tracking and interception. The Fatah 2 is even more important. It has been presented as carrying a hypersonic glide vehicle rather than a standard re-entry body. That changes the engagement problem entirely. Glide vehicles do not follow a single predictable arc. They can adjust laterally, alter trajectory, and approach from angles that conventional missile defense was not originally optimized to handle. To make that work, the missile has to survive extreme temperatures, maintain structural integrity under enormous stress, and stay controllable while moving at extraordinary speed. Very few countries are believed to have meaningful capability in that area. If Iran has operationalized even part of that technology, then Israel is not just dealing with more missiles. It is dealing with a different interception problem, and Iran appears to understand that missile defense is more than interceptors. It depends on sensors. There have been repeated claims of Iranian or allied strikes on U.S.-linked radar and air defense infrastructure across the region. One of the most serious reported cases was the destruction of an AN-TP2 radar in Jordan, later echoed in U.S. reporting. Other damage claims involving Qatar and the way are harder to independently verify in full, but the broader pattern is hard to miss. Degrade early warning, stress theater radar, then pressure the interceptor layer. That sequence is not random. It is how you break a defensive network without needing to destroy every battery one by one. Meanwhile, the war is no longer confined to a simple Iran-Israel exchange. Shipping through the Strait of Hormuz has been disrupted. Oil has pushed past $100 a barrel. Regional infrastructure has taken damage. Reports from the Gulf have raised concerns about interceptor consumption there as well. U.S. positions across the region remain under threat. This is not just a missile duel, it is a test of industrial endurance, logistics, and cost tolerance, and the cost equation favors the side spending less per attack. A relatively cheap drone can force the launch of a missile costing millions. A mixed barrage of drones, ballistic missiles, and cluster-capable payloads stretches every layer of defense at once. Reports indicate Iran has also used ballistic missiles fitted with cluster warheads, which scatter submunitions on re-entry and complicate interception. That forces defenders to spend across multiple layers, not just one. Long-range interceptors are drained, short-range systems are drained, crews are overworked, every wave becomes both an attack and a data-gathering exercise. Even more important, lower attack volume does not necessarily mean lower danger. US and Israeli officials say strikes have reduced Iran's launch capacity. Maybe they have, but as long as launches continue, the relevant question is not whether the number is down, it is whether enough are still getting through to keep imposing cost, uncertainty, and adaptation pressure. That is where the trend becomes troubling. In the June 2025 war, open-source assessments suggested that the percentage of Iranian missiles penetrating Israeli defenses increased sharply by the end of the conflict. At the start, only a small share got through. By the final phase, that share had risen substantially. Sustained fire depletes stocks, exhausts operators, and reveals defensive patterns. Apply that to a war already stretched across more than 2 weeks, with reports of critical interceptor shortages, emergency spending, and direct pressure on the companies producing the next round of interceptors, and the picture gets darker. The strategic meaning is simple. Iran is no longer only trying to hit what Israel protects. It is trying to hit what allows Israel to keep protecting it. And once the factories behind a country's air defenses become priority targets, the war is no longer just about surviving tonight's barrage. It becomes a contest over whether the defense system itself can still be regenerated fast enough to survive the next one.